When we delve into the depths of history, we realize that some civilizations left almost nothing out. Ancient Egypt is at the top of this list. They wrote about wars, they recorded the lives of kings, they documented nature, disasters, and even the smallest details of daily life. In short, everything that happened was somehow put into writing. But this is precisely where a strange situation arises. If, as the story goes, a great catastrophe occurred, if hundreds of thousands of people vanished, why is there no trace of it anywhere? No inscription, no record, not a single trace, only silence. And perhaps one of the most intriguing questions in history is precisely this. Did the exodus from Egypt actually happen? Before we continue, if you enjoy this kind of mysterious, evidence-based historical content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what we're about to share might completely change your perspective on this event. To understand why the absence of Egyptian records matters, and why it doesn't mean what skeptics assume, you need to understand how Egypt documented its own history. Egypt did not write history the way we write history. Egyptian royal inscriptions were not neutral records of events. They were theological statements. They were proclamations of divine order, royal power, and cosmic victory. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was the son of Ra, the embodiment of Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, order, and justice. Everything the pharaoh did was, by definition, in accordance with divine will, which means that defeat, catastrophe, and humiliation were not recorded. Not because scribes forgot to write them down, but because recording them would have been a theological impossibility. A pharaoh who lost could not have lost, because pharaoh was divine and the divine did not fail. This was not simply propaganda. It was cosmology. The entire Egyptian religious system depended on the fiction of pharaonic invincibility. When the Hittites fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history, Ramesses II returned to Egypt and commissioned some of the most elaborate victory monuments in Egyptian history. He built temples, he carved reliefs, he dictated poems describing his personal triumph. The poem of Pentor was carved on temple walls across Egypt. Victory scenes at Abu Simbel show Ramesses personally routing thousands of Hittite chariots. He did not record that the battle ended in a negotiated treaty because neither side could claim victory. He simply did not record that part. The treaty itself, the earliest surviving written peace treaty in human history, was found in the Hittite archives at Hattusha, not in Egypt. This is the standard operating procedure of Egyptian royal documentation. Defeat disappears. Catastrophe is reframed or erased. Foreign laborers building royal cities are recorded, but their names and origins are often reduced to generic terms like Apiru or Habiru, a word that appears across ancient Near Eastern texts, and that many scholars have connected to the Hebrew word for Hebrew. The workers who built Pi-Ramesses, almost certainly the city of Ramesses mentioned in Exodus 1:11, are documented in Egyptian administrative records. The records describe quotas of mud bricks, deliveries of straw, productivity requirements, and the names of overseers. The workers themselves are described collectively by category, not by individual name. They were economic units in an imperial labor system. If they left, that departure would not be recorded as a theological event. It would be recorded, if at all, as an administrative anomaly, a labor shortage, a missing workforce. And that is exactly the kind of absence that leaves no inscription on a temple wall. The Ipuwer Papyrus changes the picture. The Ipuwer Papyrus is an Egyptian document of disputed date. Most scholars place its composition somewhere between 1850 and 1650 BCE, though the surviving copy is later. It describes Egypt in a state of catastrophic collapse. The Nile is described as blood. The land is in darkness. Grain has perished. Foreigners have come into Egypt. The rich are now poor. The poor have become rich. The social order has been completely inverted. Cattle have been left untended. Children are dashed against walls. There is no food, no cloth, no oil. The palace is empty. The scribes have lost their records. Scholars debate whether the Ipuwer Papyrus describes real events or is a literary composition, a poetic lament rather than a historical record. but its parallels with the Exodus plagues. Water turning to blood, darkness covering the land, agricultural collapse, cattle dying, social inversion are not easily dismissed as coincidence. The parallels are too specific, too numerous, and too sequentially similar to the biblical account to be brushed aside without serious engagement. The Ahmose Tempest Stele, discovered at Karnak and dating to the reign of Ahmose I around 1550 BCE, describes a catastrophic storm of darkness and rain that caused widespread destruction across Egypt. The Stele records that the storm was unprecedented in human memory and was interpreted by the pharaoh as divine punishment. Some researchers have connected this event to the Santorini volcanic eruption of roughly 1600 BCE, an eruption whose ash cloud and tsunami effects would have been felt across the eastern Mediterranean. Others have connected it to the darkness plague of Exodus. The Stele is not an Exodus text, but it demonstrates something critical. Catastrophic, supernatural events did happen in Egypt during the general period of the Exodus, and at least some of them were preserved in Egyptian records. Not as historical accounts, but as theological laments and royal responses to divine displeasure. None of this proves the Exodus, but it establishes something important. The argument from silence, if the Exodus happened, Egypt would have recorded it, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how Egypt documented its own history. Egypt would not have recorded a catastrophic defeat at the hands of a foreign god. That is precisely the kind of event Egyptian royal theology was designed to erase. The silence is not evidence of absence. The silence is evidence of Egypt being exactly what Egypt always was. A civilization that recorded its victories and buried its defeats. If the textual record is silent, the archaeological record is not. In the eastern Nile Delta, in the region the Bible calls Goshen, the land where the Israelites are said to have lived during their time in Egypt, Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak has been excavating a site called Tel el-Dab'a since 1966. What he found there has permanently changed the scholarly conversation about the Exodus. Tel el-Dab'a is ancient Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos, a Semitic people from Canaan who migrated into Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period and eventually ruled the northern Delta region for over a century. The Hyksos are not the Israelites, but the archaeological record of their presence in the Delta contains details that align with the biblical account in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The population at Tel el-Dab'a was Semitic in origin. The material culture, pottery styles, burial practices, architectural forms shows clear Canaanite influence. At its height, Avaris was a massive urban center with a population that Bietak estimates at the upper range of what would be consistent with the biblical numbers for the Israelite population in Egypt. Then, at a specific point in the stratigraphic record, something extraordinary happens. The Semitic population disappears, not gradually, not through the kind of slow demographic shift that leaves transitional layers in the archaeological record. The Semitic cultural material simply stops. The city continues. Avaris later becomes the site of the new kingdom city of Pyramuses. Almost certainly the Ramesses city mentioned in Exodus 1:11 as one of the cities built by Israelite labor. But the Semitic population that built the early city is gone. Bietak himself is cautious about connecting this directly to the biblical Exodus. The chronology is disputed. The departure of the Semitic population at Avaris appears to coincide with the expulsion of the Hyksos by the pharaoh Ahmose I around 1550 BCE, which is earlier than most traditional Exodus chronologies. But the basic pattern, a large Semitic population in the eastern delta building cities suddenly gone, matches the biblical narrative in its broad outlines more closely than anything else archaeology has found. There is more. A tomb painting discovered at Beni Hassan, dating to approximately 1900 BCE, depicts a group of Semitic people, identified by their clothing and appearance as clearly non-Egyptian. Arriving in Egypt, they are shown as skilled craftsmen and workers. The painting gives their leader the name Abisha the Hyksos. Some scholars have seen in this image a visual representation of the kind of Semitic migration into Egypt that the Bible describes for the family of Jacob. More dramatically, in the area around Tel el-Dabah, archaeologists have found evidence of a large administrative complex that shows signs of Semitic cultural influence alongside Egyptian palatial architecture. Near this complex, they found something even more striking: a garden tomb containing the remains of a man buried in the style of a high official, with a coat of many colors, a garment of multiple pieces of fabric in an Egyptian Semitic hybrid style, hanging above the burial. The tomb is empty. The body was removed in antiquity, deliberately and carefully removed, leaving behind only the burial goods. Who removes a body deliberately from a tomb? Who cares enough about the physical remains of a specific individual to carry them out of Egypt? The Bible records that Moses carried the bones of Joseph out of Egypt during the Exodus. Genesis 50:25 records Joseph making the Israelites swear an oath. God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Exodus 13:19 records Moses fulfilling that oath. No archaeologist has claimed this is Joseph's tomb. The identification cannot be proved, but the empty tomb of a high Semitic official in the Egyptian Delta, with evidence of deliberate removal of the body in the exact region where the Bible places the Israelites, is not nothing. The most common objection to the historical Exodus is not the silence of Egyptian records. It is the numbers. Exodus 12:37 states that approximately 600,000 men left Egypt on foot, not counting women and children. If we include women, children, and the mixed multitude of non-Israelite people who joined the departure, the total figure implied by the text is somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. 2 to 3 million people crossing the Sinai Peninsula. 2 to 3 million people wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. 2 to 3 million people consuming food and water in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. For perspective, the entire population of ancient Egypt at its height is estimated at somewhere between 3 and 5 million people. The idea that Egypt could have lost half its workforce without a single surviving record is, on its face, implausible. Archaeological surveys of the Sinai have found no evidence of this. No campsites, no trash middens, no burial sites, no pottery. Nothing that would indicate the presence of millions of people for decades. The most thorough survey, conducted by Israeli archaeologist Eliezer Oren in the 1970s, found evidence of Egyptian military installations along the northern Sinai route and Bronze Age settlements at scattered oases, but nothing consistent with the movement of a population of millions. This is the argument that skeptics use most forcefully, and it is a serious argument. Kenneth Kitchen, one of the foremost Egyptologists of the 20th century and a scholar who broadly accepts the historicity of the Exodus, describes the numbers as the most difficult problem in the entire Exodus discussion. But the numbers problem dissolves, or at least diminishes significantly, when you look at the Hebrew text more carefully. The word translated as thousand in most English Bibles, the Hebrew word eleph, does not unambiguously mean 1,000. In several other biblical contexts, eleph refers to a military unit, a clan unit, or simply a large group. Numbers 1, which contains the detailed census of the Israelite tribes, uses eleph in ways that produce mathematically impossible total army sizes if you insist on the literal reading of 1,000 per occurrence. The tribe of Simeon, for example, is listed as having 59 eleph and 300 men, which, in the standard translation, gives 59,300 fighting men from a single tribe. But Simeon is consistently described elsewhere as one of the smaller tribes, nearly absorbed by Judah. 60,000 soldiers from Simeon alone is inconsistent with every other piece of evidence about Simeon's relative size. If eleph in the census texts refers to clan units or military contingents rather than thousands of individuals, the total population implied by the text drops dramatically, from 2 million to somewhere between 20 and 40,000 people. 20 to 40,000 people crossing the Sinai and living in the wilderness for a generation would leave a much lighter archaeological footprint. It would not necessarily leave the kind of massive debris field that skeptics expect. Hunter-gatherer groups of this size, moving through desert environments, leave traces that are extraordinarily difficult to find even with modern survey techniques. This reinterpretation is not a modern apologetic invention. It is a textual observation that has been made by scholars ranging from George Mendenhall in the 1950s to Colin Humphreys more recently. Humphreys, a physicist and biblical scholar at Cambridge, has worked through the numbers in extraordinary detail and concludes that the actual Exodus group was probably in the range of 20,000 people, a figure consistent with both the Egyptian administrative evidence and the archaeological surveys of the Sinai. The question becomes, what kind of event would leave the archaeological and textual traces we actually have? Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer has spent decades arguing that the biblical account of the Exodus reflects genuine knowledge of Egyptian culture, geography, and administrative practice that a later author simply could not have invented. The names of Egyptian officials in the Exodus narrative, Potipharah, Zaphanath-Paneah, Shiphrah, Puah, are authentic Egyptian names of the period, not later fabrications. The description of the forced labor system, the mud brick construction requirements, the role of taskmasters and overseers, the requirement to gather one's own straw. All of it reflects actual Egyptian administrative practice confirmed by archaeological evidence from the Delta region. The Brooklyn Papyrus, an Egyptian administrative document dating to approximately 1740 BCE, contains a list of household servants. Among the names on the list are clearly Semitic names, names that are recognizably related to Hebrew personal names. Shiphrah, the name of one of the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1, appears on the Brooklyn Papyrus in Egypt at the right period as the name of a Semitic slave. That name had to come from somewhere. A later author inventing the story in the 6th century BCE could not have known that Shiphrah was a genuine Semitic name in use among Egyptian servants during the Second Intermediate period. That knowledge could only have come from genuine historical memory, from actual records now lost, or from documents that preserved authentic details of an authentic event. Someone who wrote the Exodus story knew Egypt, not the Egypt of a much later period, when foreign writers might have been familiar with it through trade or diplomacy. The Egypt of the 2nd millennium BCE, a world that had largely vanished from living memory by the time most critical scholars believe the text was composed. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. If the Exodus happened, where did it happen? The route described in the biblical text has been debated for centuries. The traditional identification places Mount Sinai at Jebel Musa in the southern Sinai Peninsula, the location venerated by Christian pilgrims since the 4th century CE, and the site of St. Catherine's Monastery, one of the oldest continuously inhabited Christian monasteries in the world. But this identification has no archaeological support from the biblical period. There is no evidence of Israelite presence at Jebel Musa in the 2nd millennium BCE. The tradition appears to have been established by Byzantine Empress Helena in the early 4th century CE, roughly 700 years after the events it commemorates. Alternative proposals have located the crossing of the sea at the northern end of the Sinai, where the shallow waters of the ancient Lake Bala, now largely dried up and incorporated into the Suez Canal, could plausibly have been crossed by a large group and could plausibly have overwhelmed an Egyptian chariot force in specific wind and tidal conditions. The Hebrew phrase translated as Red Sea in most English Bibles is actually Yam Suf, which more accurately means Sea of Reeds. The Sea of Reeds is not the deep Red Sea. It is a shallow reed-fringed body of water in the eastern delta, precisely the kind of environment that Lake Bala represented before it was altered by modern canal construction. Colin Humphreys, the Cambridge physicist, has modeled a wind-down scenario in which sustained easterly winds could expose a shallow crossing point that has been validated by oceanographic modeling published in peer-reviewed journals. The model is not proof of the Exodus, but it demonstrates that the physical mechanism described in the biblical text is scientifically possible in the specific geography of the eastern delta. The location of Mount Sinai itself may be at Jebel al-Lawz in northwestern Arabia, a location in the ancient region of Midian, where the Bible says Moses was when he first encountered God in the burning bush. This location has several advantages over the traditional Jebel Musa identification. It places the mountain in Midian, consistent with the biblical text. The surrounding landscape in northwestern Arabia is volcanic, and the descriptions in Exodus of what happened at Sinai are strikingly consistent with volcanic activity, fire and smoke on the mountain, the ground shaking, a loud trumpet-like sound, thick cloud, the summit apparently untouchable by ordinary humans. These are not the typical descriptions of a thunderstorm. They read like the descriptions of a volcanic eruption. The Santorini connection complicates everything further and illuminates it. The massive volcanic eruption of the island of Thera, modern Santorini, in the Aegean Sea is now dated by ice core analyses and radiocarbon dating to approximately 1620 BCE, give or take a few decades. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The ash cloud from Santorini covered vast areas of the eastern Mediterranean. The tsunami generated by the eruption would have struck the Egyptian Delta coast. Acid rain from the sulfur dioxide released by the eruption could have contaminated water sources. Atmospheric ash could have turned the sky dark across the region for months. Crop failures from atmospheric cooling and acid rain would have followed. Some researchers have argued that the Santorini eruption provides a natural mechanism for several of the Exodus plagues. The water contamination, the darkness, the agricultural failures, the livestock deaths from contaminated pasture, the skin lesions from acid rain. Professor Ciro Trevisanato, a Canadian chemist and ancient historian, has published detailed research connecting specific plagues to specific volcanic effects in a systematic way that goes beyond casual correlation. The chronological challenge is real. The most commonly proposed date for the Exodus, based on the biblical reference to 480 years before the temple foundation in the 4th year of Solomon, which places the Exodus around 1446 BCE, does not align with the Santorini eruption date of 1620 BCE. But the biblical chronology of this period is itself contested, and some scholars place the Exodus considerably earlier than 1446 BCE, in the general period of the Hyksos expulsion around 1550 BCE, which is much closer to the Santorini date. What emerges from this evidence is not a single clean narrative. It is a complex picture of overlapping possibilities, contested chronologies, and partial evidence pointing in broadly consistent directions. The Santorini eruption happened. It affected Egypt. The Ipuwer Papyrus describes catastrophic conditions in Egypt. The Amos Tempest Stele describes unprecedented darkness and rain. Tel el-Daba shows a Semitic population in the Delta that vanishes suddenly. The Brooklyn Papyrus contains genuine Hebrew names among Egyptian servants. The Amarna letters describe Habiru groups destabilizing Canaan at the right period. The Merneptah Stele confirms Israel's existence in Canaan by 1208 BCE. Every piece of evidence is consistent with an Exodus. None of it individually proves one. That is the honest assessment. And that honest assessment is more interesting than either the dogmatic affirmation that every detail is literally confirmed, or the dogmatic dismissal that nothing happened. The Exodus is not only a historical question, it is a theological foundation and a prophetic one. Every subsequent prophetic tradition in the Hebrew Bible builds on the Exodus as its primary reference point. When the prophets of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE want to describe divine deliverance, they return to Egypt. When Isaiah wants to describe a second redemption, he describes it as a second Exodus. There will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who remain, as there was for Israel when they came up from the land of Egypt. When Hosea describes God's relationship with Israel, he uses the language of the original departure. Out of Egypt I called my son. The Exodus is not one story among many in the prophetic imagination. It is the story. It is the lens through which every subsequent act of divine deliverance is interpreted. Remove it. Reduce it to pure mythology with no historical foundation, and the entire architecture of biblical prophecy loses its anchor. But here is what most Bible teachers will not focus on. The Exodus narrative itself contains prophetic elements that were understood from very early in the tradition to have future fulfillment. The Passover is not simply a memorial of a past event. It is a forward-pointing ritual. The lamb without blemish, the blood on the doorposts, the haste of departure, the firstborn spared. Every element was understood by later Jewish and Christian interpreters as simultaneously remembering the past and anticipating a greater fulfillment. The night of the Passover in Egypt had a specific structure: lamb, blood, door, death passing over. That structure recurs in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul states in 1 Corinthians 5:7, "Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." He does not explain the metaphor because he assumes his readers understand the Passover. The entire sacrificial system of the New Testament is built on Exodus typology. The Last Supper is a Passover meal. The crucifixion happens at Passover. The timing is not incidental. It is the point. The book of Revelation takes this further. The 7 trumpet judgments of Revelation 8 and 9 parallel the plagues of Egypt with unmistakable deliberateness. Hail and fire mixed with blood, matching the 7th plague. The sea turning to blood, matching the 1st plague. Darkness, matching the 9th plague. Locusts, matching the 8th plague. The parallel is not loose allusion, it is structural. The author of Revelation is presenting the final judgments of history as a cosmic recapitulation of the Exodus plagues. What happened to Egypt is happening again, this time to the whole world. The Gog and Magog prophecy of Ezekiel 38 and 39 adds another layer. Ezekiel, writing from Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, describes an end-times invasion of Israel by a great coalition from the north. God's response to that invasion, fire, earthquake, plague, confusion, deliberately echoes the language of the Exodus plagues. Ezekiel 38:22 reads, "I will execute judgment upon him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on his troops and on the many nations with him." Plague, fire, hailstones. This is Exodus language applied to the last days. The connection between the Exodus and end times prophecy is not a modern evangelical invention. It is built into the text at the structural level. The prophets of Israel understood the Exodus as the paradigmatic act of divine intervention, the template against which all future divine interventions would be measured and described. The Exodus was not just history. It was prophecy in the form of history, an event so structurally significant that it would be repeated at the end of time. The Merneptah Stele, dated to 1208 BCE, provides the anchor. It contains the earliest known external reference to Israel as a people. Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. The inscription is pharaonic military propaganda, Merneptah claiming victory over various Canaanite peoples and tribes. But its significance for the Exodus question is decisive in one direction. By 1208 BCE, Israel existed as a recognized ethnic group in Canaan, distinct enough from the surrounding populations to be named separately on a royal inscription. They had to have come from somewhere. The biblical account says they came from Egypt. No alternative account of Israelite origins has ever been proposed that is as consistent with the available evidence as the Exodus narrative. The prophecy was written in Egypt. The fulfillment unfolded across centuries. And the echoes of that original night, lamb, blood, door, deliverance, are still being heard. The Exodus story does not exist in isolation. It exists within a broader ancient Near Eastern world that has left its own records. Records that, when read alongside the biblical account, create picture more complex and more compelling than either source alone. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt in 1887 and dated to the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE, contain urgent appeals from Canaanite city-state rulers to the pharaoh for military assistance against groups called the Habiru. The word appears in letter after letter. Labayu of Shechem is accused of giving Canaanite territory to the Habiru. The ruler of Jerusalem writes to the pharaoh, "The Habiru plunder all the lands of the king. If there are no archers this year, all the lands of the king will be lost." The ruler of Megiddo describes the Habiru seizing an entire city. The urgency is palpable across 3,000 years of clay. The Habiru in the Amarna letters are not simply a tribe. They are a social category, people who exist outside the normal structures of settled civilization, people who move between communities, who sometimes serve as mercenaries and sometimes as raiders. Some scholars identify the Habiru entirely with the Israelites entering Canaan. Others argue that the Habiru were a much broader social group of which the Israelites were a part. Either way, the Amarna letters show that by the 14th century BCE, a group known to their contemporaries by a name closely related to Hebrew was making significant trouble in Canaan, exactly where the book of Joshua places the Israelite arrival after the Exodus. The Ugaritic texts, a collection of mythological and administrative literature from the ancient Syrian city of Ugarit, destroyed around 1185 BCE, provide a detailed picture of the Canaanite religious world that Israel entered. They describe Baal, Asherah, El, Mot, Yam, the divine figures the Bible identifies as the gods of Israel's neighbors. They describe religious practices, sacred prostitution, child sacrifice, divination, that the biblical prophets condemn with precise detail. The Ugaritic world is the world the Bible describes. The gods are real gods who had real worshippers. The practices condemned in the law of Moses are practices that archaeology has now confirmed were actually practiced. And at the center of that world, the thing that made Israel different, that separated the people who came out of Egypt from every other ancient Near Eastern nation, was a specific claim. Not a general claim about divine power or national destiny, a specific historical falsifiable claim that on a specific night, in a specific place, a specific god had acted. That lamb's blood on a doorframe had meant the difference between life and death. That a sea had opened. That a people had walked through on dry ground. That claim was either true or it was not. If it was true, if the Exodus happened, if the plagues fell, if the sea opened, then the God who did those things is still the God of history, still capable of acting, still watching the nations, still aware of every empire that believes itself permanent, and every people that has been told their redemption is impossible. The Exodus does not end with Moses on the far shore. It ends with a promise. What was done once can be done again. The prophets built their entire vision of the future on that promise. The New Testament writers understood the crucifixion and resurrection as its ultimate fulfillment. And the book of Revelation presents the final chapter of history as its cosmic recapitulation. The ground beneath Egypt is still being excavated. Tel el-Dab'a is still yielding new layers. New papyri are still being discovered. The picture is incomplete, but it is not empty. And every year, the incomplete picture looks more like the one the Bible has been describing for 3,000 years. Egypt was a civilization that recorded nearly everything we can imagine. But on certain matters, it chose to remain silent. When we take a closer look at this silence, we realize that it may not be as simple as to be overlooked. Because for a civilization that put everything into writing, failing to record its own defeat, or an event that would shake its sacred order, is actually not surprising. The land, however, tells a different story. Traces of a Semitic population in the Delta region, records of an early Israelite presence in Canaan, cultural similarities, and details mentioned in ancient narratives. None of these, on their own, provide a definitive conclusion. But when taken together, a picture emerges that is hard to ignore. Perhaps this is precisely what makes the Exodus from Egypt so compelling. We don't have a single document that proves everything, but it's not an empty narrative that can be completely dismissed either. On one side, there is silence. On the other, a memory that has endured for thousands of years, and this memory has continued to be passed down from generation to generation. We were slaves, and we were saved. Now the real question is, was the Exodus from Egypt truly a historical event, or was it a powerful narrative that grew and evolved over time, shaping a people's identity? What do you think? A real event, or one of history's most compelling stories of faith?